Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iran, Turkey, and for part Russia as well, and Iraq, of course, last but not least in this story. And our monthly series of seminar is about predatory state, conflict and resistance. And if there is somewhere in the world that there is a movement which can, we can attach clearly the word resistance and conflict, is the Kurdish people, or Kurdishness in general, which is not just one thing, but several. And I have to say that we have also the chance to listen to Omer in the perspective of a Polanyian perspective of embeddedness, disembeddedness. He will be having 45 to 50 minutes to expose his book. And Mehmet will give us the pleasure to discuss that for 15 minutes. Then there will be an answer, of course, by Omer to his critical assessment. And then the floor will be open to whoever wants to formulate any comments or suggestions. But before, passing the floor to Omer, I know that Sahar, whose thesis, PhD thesis is on Kurdish question, and we hope that we will be having you in her PhD dissertation. I would like if she has something to say that she says, and then we start. I have to ask also other colleagues who organize. We know that both colleagues, Mehmet and Omer, have given their permission to be recorded. Any colleagues here, especially Philip, as we see here, he is the director of our research unit, and also Nicola and Orion, as well as Adriano. If you have something to add, you can, and we start right away. Apparently, no. Sahar, please.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here this evening. I would like to present both of our speakers. As Mehmet said, the subject and the subject of the Omer's is well fitted with the aims and objectives of our seminar. And as I find his work, it's a valuable historical contribution and rich theoretical work in Kurdish question from a political economy perspective. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Omer Tekdemir is a lecturer in political economy at Coventry University, managing editor of the open access journal New Middle Eastern Studies, and the co-governor of international studies of the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Asia Working Group of the British International Studies Association. He is also a visiting research fellow at Bolton University and work at the University of Leicester and the University of Westminster. He holds a PhD from the School of Government and International Affairs and alumni of Ustinov College at Durham University. He's the author of Constituting the Political Economy of the Kurds, Social Embeddedness, Hegemony and Identity, published by Rachel in 2021. His interdisciplinary articles have appeared in a range of peer-reviewed journals focusing on political economy, international relations, and political theory, with particular reference to the Kurds, Turkey, and the Middle East. He's a frequent contributor to different media outlets, including Open Democracy and The Conversation, and writes extensively on populism, identity, democracy, and moral economy. Our discussant is Professor Mehmet Asutay, a prominent expert in Islamic moral economics and finance. He teaches Middle Eastern and Islamic political economy and finance at Durham University, and he is the director of Durham Doctoral Training Center in Islamic Finance. Professor Asutay is the managing editor of the Review of Islamic Economics, the associate editor of the American Journal of Islamic Social Science, and the editorial board of International Journal of Islamic and Middle Eastern Finance and Management and Borsa Istanbul Review. Many thanks to both of you for having accepted our invitation, and I give the floor to Mehmet, to Omer. Please, Omer, start.
Thank you, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for your kind invitation and very generous introduction. And thank you, Professor Wahabi, as well, and as well as many institutions take initiative to organize this event. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys. And I'm also grateful to Professor Asutay participating to our discussion, and as well as contribution to the book. You know, it's a production of many years of intellectual laboring. So as you briefly mentioned it, what we aim here, we will try to bring the different perspective angles to the so-called today's Kurdish question. It's not limited within the Turkey. It's a result of the end of the Ottoman Empire, which is related with Iran, Iraq, Syria, and even predominantly, if you look at the today politics, is related even with the European and further because of the immigration problem, because of the civil war, and so on and so forth. So it is definitely, as you said, fits with your seminar aim and objective. It's related with resistance and conflict. But our position, intellectual positions here, we didn't want to follow up existing literature and focusing these questions through nationalist approach, nationalism theoretical framework. Rather, we prefer not in a way of the social engineering. We first of all analyze the Kurdish history, Kurdish political history, and then we comes out with the idea that this history requires a different explanation, different discipline to understand the different formats and different conjuncture of the Kurdish political economy and as well as identity. So the idea was here is creating three main historical periods in the format of the case study, in understanding the nature of the Kurdish model, which we prefer to say model, and we also propose as an emergent middle power in the Middle East, as an unorthodox and alternative practice in the Middle East. Hence, three distinguished conjectural and critical accounts are utilized to understand the microdynamics, such as society and agents, rather than macro factors, such as states, by engaging an innovative methodology, which helps to go beyond essential analysis. So our position is, we didn't want to just say critical analysis, we really meant it, and by our methodology and as well as theoretical framework, combination of the couple of different theories and disciplines to create a very unique understanding of the questions, and as well as trying to contribute to the field as well. So as I said, the book based on the three main cases. It's starting with the political economy by using Karkolany, and then goes to indicates the relation between the society, Kurdish society and state, particularly new state, Republic of Turkey, through the hegemonic relation, power relation, and as well as goes to the focus on identity politics, which is the contemporary issues, contemporary modern Turkey, and as well as different political agents emerge, and identity politics became subject of the for the Kurdish questions. Then we talk about social constructivism. Even we are bringing to the very recent politics, talking about left-wing populism of the recent Kurdish-led. I prefer to say Kurdish-led rather than pro-Kurdish, and as well as left-wing populist party HDP. But today I'm not going to go through all these very rich theoretical framework and as well as historical trajectories of the Kurds from Ottoman Empire to the modern Turkey. I don't think so. You will have that much patience to listen to me, and we will have enough time to do that. So I prefer to keep it within the first case study of the book, which is the political economy of the Kurds, and try to also show and demonstrate how the political economy of Kurds emerge and constitute, and how this political economy later to lose the control and then cause so-called Kurdish questions by focusing and analyzing internal dynamics rather than external, because external dynamics has been exhausted by many works in the literature. So we don't want to go to again repeat what has been said in the literature and indicated the states. Rather, we focus on the internal institutions. So what we says in this first part of the book, as a first case studies of the book as well, we critically analyze the moral economy nature of the Kurdish social formation, which has prevented it from fully integrating into the transformation of the political economy of the 19th century and market economy developments of the late empire until the new republic. I argue the Kurdish case represents and fits perfectly with Polanyian moral economy framework, particularly during the Ottoman Empire, and hence capitalization and modernization of the state. The embedded economy theories, such as moralizing economy in tribal, which is culture, and religious values, and identity and discourse analysis at both the historical and contemporary reading constitute multiple frames used in this book to explore the emerging and evolving nature of the Kurdish questions in Turkey. Perhaps you can also implement these framework, these templates to the different Kurdish reality, Kurdish cases in the different states as well, such as Iran, Iraq, and Syria. With reference to this chronological evolution and present progress by challenging the dominant nationalism approach. Moreover, my initial question is here, why is constituting? My claim is the concept of constituting is missing in the literature and is minimizing, as many studies work within the existing political economies of the large environment, such as the empire or republic's political economy. In this research, I provide a micro frame based on foundation of political economy by referring to the interaction within the Kurdish internal institution, social cultural values and political traditions, and focusing so-called on the non-state actors, and to also criticize some of the existing political economy approach by focusing non-state actors and indicating the having political economy not necessarily to relate it with the state and the state structure. And rather, what we do here, interaction with the we interact with the dominant state centrism approach, but prefer to look at it in a different perspective. I explore the non-linear modernization and uneven development of Kurdish society and its internal dynamics in relation to its everyday life and norms, and work against the institutionalization of self-regulating market economy, the Kurdish life expectation, characteristics of the society and its structure, understanding of the independence or having state, economic mode of production, conventional institutions such as endogamy, and social cultural values like including religion, did not require to be part of the modernity as because of they argue having different civilization. So what we are doing here, we also criticize modernist perspective. We are saying because they didn't want to be part of these modernization process of the Zeitgeist, that doesn't mean they didn't have their own civilization and as well as their own structure. The only problem here, it wasn't fit what has been proposed to the 19th century society in a global context. So Karl Polanyi's eminent theory of embeddedness and his moral economy as a core argument is increasingly employed by interdisciplinary scholars, including political economy, political theory, sociology, anthropology, and international relations. Polanyi, in his magnum opus, The Great Transformation, identifies that how the pursuit of liberal expansion materialize and does the society move into the self-regulating market economy system. Therefore, this radical shift into market economy is marked with the emergence of fictitious commodities, which replace the substantial principle of reciprocity and redistribution through this embedded economy from its social fabric. Moreover, the new order has succeeded with economic transformation of the civil societies into market society, which is the illusion for Polanyi, and creation of the political societies within the form of nation states. The nation states has been back nationalization debt and acting once more as market maker in an effort to restore the regime and replace the multicultural empire. Subsequently, Polanyi highlights the role of the nation state, hence the politics, in the center of analysis of market economy and expanding of the market economy. Thus, the institutionalization of the political economy is constructing national identity and consciousness. Besides, the Polanyi's framework and Polanyi's in that seminal work never denies the utility of market for allocation of goods, but he advocated the market took its place alongside other principles, such as reciprocity and redistribution, as the economy is embedded social institution. You could actually add these so many other human relations, solidarity, gift economy, so on and so forth. Therefore, Polanyi portrays conversation of the political economic system in the 19th century age as the subordination of social structure to the market economy through disembedding the economic relations of the society from social and political life, and sort of treating economy as a separate entity and independent relations from the other human relations, which is occurred by the creation of the fictitious commodities of labor, land, and money as beyond human agency. Accordingly, Polanyi describes the notion of the double movement, whereby society reacts in protectionist way to preserve itself against this so-called satanic mill from the ravages of the liberal laissez-faire through the re-embedding the economy into social and political sphere. Hence, construct a new form of social regulation through a number of emerge from such as trade unions of today. As he emphasizes on the spin hamlet, which is a poor law regulation in the UK, in England, of protecting poor such as peasants and small farmers to be proletarian in catastrophic way, as well as bound this labor force to perish in the industrialization process of England, which was the society respond to harmful effect of the industrial revolution and postponing of capitalism. It is emerging as a social protectionist counter movement while the market economy is expanded over livelihoods. As a result, Polanyi argues the utopian project of liberal creed is kind of via disembedding market economy from the social relation and institutions is a fantasy and imaginary construction that also creates fictitious commodities by buying and selling the very essence of humanity. If you consider from the today perspective, such as employment system, real estate, supplies of money, credit, and financializations of the neoliberal system. And hence, let the double movement, whereby various agents attempt to protect the society against the free market economic system. To hold embeddedness as a human motive is inherently shaped in economic motivation. Here also we need to highlight it. When Polanyi says that society reacted to this kind of expanding of the liberal market economy and occupying people's relations by materializing everything, he doesn't really mention it how the reaction should be. Sometimes reaction could be through very undemocratic way as well. So therefore, Polanyi highlighted that liberal actors, liberal agents needs to take the control of these reaction, which you can actually also see today's rise of the right-wing populism. have right-wing populist political parties using people is anger, people is fear, people is anxious about insecurity of the job, a precarity of the market economy, and so on and so forth. So the problem is here for Polanyi in the first place is not how people is reacted, but people is social institutions, including judiciary, including any other institution in our daily life, responded such expanded. So this is the question of the democracy is another concept which we can discuss it, as I discuss in the book, how radical democracy came out as a part of these political economic process. But again, as I said, I'm going to limit it only within the Ottoman Empire. So to sum up, the work of Polanyi provides a prospective language drawn from anthropological method for creating historical accounts of market breakdowns, which might active political mobilization against the market world and state's hegemony. Hence, Karl Polanyi's great transformation and embeddedness frame are utilized to examine the nature of the Kurdish mode of production in the late Ottoman imperial era by referring to the anthropological realities of the 19th century's everydayness, resulting in a rejection of the market economy, and focusing on the forming of the political economy of the Kurds during the de facto autonomy of emirates, which is in Kurdish called mirs, which is based on cultural, such as tribal, and religious, such as Islamic, but not necessarily only limited with Islam. You could have different type of the Kurdish faith, such as Yazidis or Alevis and Eastern Christians version of Christianity among the Kurdish society, as these values and impacts the awakening of the Kurdish national consciousness. When the empire was transforming towards the self-regulating market economic system with the Tanzimat centralization project and Young Turks westernization, modernization process, which is not organically because of the European pressure of the time, the Kurds, on the other hand, insist in their traditional political economic system, such as de facto autonomy and social cultural institution that embedded in economic relation. It's a kind of away from commoditization and fictitious commodities of land, nature, and money. They rejected the empire transformation project. The Kurdish angle to this new ordering process was appearing in an antagonistic sense, responding and reacting to the state-led industrialization and economic development activity in the region. They protect their political cultural identity and pursue conflict in the context of the double movement. Such transformation on the ground of moral economy, as they wanted to protect and develop themselves within traditional, which is they call tribals as ashirs, and spiritual religious, which is Islamic norms, and values that already embedded in the political economy of their societies. Particularly land is the pivotal element of the Kurdish political economy and controlled by customs and values of this traditional order. However, it has resulted in Kurds not being able to reach in the end their own nation states during the so-called modern institutionalization and industrialization project of the 19th century, which simultaneously left Kurdish society, perhaps even today, as an undeveloped or late developed nations, and became the subject of the internal colonizations of the different states, Westphalian states in the Middle East, such as Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Thus, this great, what I call regression, opposite way of the Karl Polanyi's great transformation, remain an important demarcation line in the trajectory of the Kurdish political economy in the modern times. Since the priority here to set framework and discuss trajectories of the Kurdish great transformation process, which is it's not really happened, we will be asking the question to indicate the impact and the role of the internal dynamics in the opportunity of the 19th century's New World Order, such as what was the nature of social formation or the form of social life in Kurdish society in this century? What was the role of Kurdish internal social and political agents and how they performed during the transformation of Ottoman Empire? What impacts did the social structure have on society's transformation process in terms of political and economic extents? How did political leaders respond, furthermore, be failed in the anticipated transformation of the time? Therefore, answering these questions provides an opportunity to discuss dimension of uneven development in terms of the political economy of the Kurds by making direct reference to the embeddedness, or in Kurdish case, or disembeddedness, the modes of production, and the concept of the modern institution. In this respect, utilizing the theoretical framework that offered and developed by Polanyi help us to analyze the nature and content of the society formation through the mode of production as a concept within peripheral economy, culture, and anthropological, and as well as ethnographic aspects. At the same time, this political economy outline helps to locate the reasons behind the persistence of the social base, grassroots, and the social political protectionist behavior against the change into a modern society by insisting on an embedded reciprocity and redistribution originated economy. The context of the base has not exactly been easily observed and has not changed tremendously since the Kurds converted to Islam. As a result, the dynamic of society still keeps many traditional institutions. As the failure of Kurdish transformation in this momentum is mostly referred by the essentialist modernist perspective in the concept of deficiency of political economic modern institutions such as nation state, we are analyzing the macro and micro external dynamics without giving more attention on the internal factors. Hence, the literature in relation to understanding Kurdish underdevelopment is limited, as reference is mostly made to external factors and direct results. This kind of led us to focus on the lack of systematic expectation and explanation of the Kurdish late development has motivated to this study and ask question what internal factors impact the transformation process and what did embeddedness means for Kurds and how, in which way, resistance to the modernization process in the Kurdish society. In responding again to these questions and the essentialist, modernist, and linear developments approach, which argues absence of the modern institution, such as nation state, bourgeois, working class, or civil society, constitute an obstacle to Kurdish society's transformation process of the time, which are not deniable. However, our intention is here to dispel and goes beyond such external and macro factors by examining the society aspiration to modernity as expressed and articulated by the contents of the inner results through bottom-up perspective. Consequently, the Kurds, we are not integrated, or they are not really integrated, or they are not really interested in modern institutions during the emergence of self-regulated market economy in the late Ottoman period, which had already been started, driving the Central Ottoman embedded imperial political economy as the everyday life of Kurds has been experienced and conceptualized in a strong spiritual, religious values and customs rather than capitalist and materialist concepts. The first traces of the Kurdish attempt at transformation in the modern meaning can be found in the fin de skill, which the reality represent an age when the failure of the transformation and development of Kurdish society was heavily witnessed, while Ottoman was preparing for the new order. Thus, the 19th century can be identified as the period of the so-called missed opportunities for Kurds according modernist point of view. It is also beginning of the new relation between the Kurds and Turkish state in the context of hegemony theory, which is subject of the book's second part and second case. which we're going to not really discuss it much in here today. Subsequently, as an outcome of the 19th century political economy origin, the transformation of the Kurdish political economy was formed in the counter-principles, through contradictory terms with the semi-capitalist and nationalist states. Therefore, two determinist doctrines of the double movement define the dynamics of society during the period of transformation. On the one hand, a nationalist self-regulated market economy dominant and oppressive political economy of the state policy, and on the other hand, the socio-cultural protectionist behavior of the regional agents that against the destructive change of traditional moral economy as a counter-movement. We are not denying the role of nationalism in this era. However, what we argue is the relation between the state and Kurds cannot be explained by only using the nationalism. So the political economy comes here, particularly not just the political economy, classical political economy, but not based on the statistics, numbers, or as well as the macro actors, rather the more humanist, unorthodox political economy, focusing on cultural political economy and moral economy would be very beneficial to understand such as complex question. So how? The Kurdish sui generis character and its ideocentric institution, such as custom, values, and cultural and economic system have played a crucial role, as well as not facilitated the non-19th century's inclusive transformation or renovation offers, as Polanyi's account explains how the 19th century society has transformed into the self-regulated market economy. Don't get me wrong here, because what we are trying to say is it's not just these kind of characteristic elements or social structure only related with the Kurdish society here. You could actually argue this for Arab society, for Armenian society, and for Albanian society, who are the subject of the Ottoman Empire. But our argument is here, the other nations created their national unity and fight for their independence during the Ottoman Empire, and they were really willing to be part of these new world order, which has been introduced by particularly superpower Western powers to the new world order, such as industrialization, such as having nation states. Our arguments, our claim is here. The Kurdish society for a long time didn't really want to be part of this new order and resisted, as they were happy in their anarchic, in their self-sufficient economic system. So we will come back what's happened when they realize what they missed. Considering all these dynamics, analyzing the historiography of Ottoman social and Kurdish political economic institution, such as Kriv, which is kind of godfather institution, marriage and the journey, marrying each other within the tribes, tribal relations, political actors, agas, sheikhs after the mirs, or kinships became a fruitful tools with employing the Polanyian perspective that allow us to develop a much needed historical perspective on the transformation process of Kurdish politics and as well as economic life, the institutional change and after its responses. This perspective also provides an alternative view and offers a political economic system of pre-capitalist society, such as clan, tribe, and indigenous groups, while highlights how the society reacted to new political economy coordination that impose on them. So again, when we say they didn't want to, that doesn't mean this has happened because they wish and then it didn't happen at all. The Ottoman Empire, as we said, they want to really transform their imperial in order to save the empire, and therefore they push the Kurdish society be part of this transformation. So the Ottoman social and political structure and its relationship with the Kurds has been changed. So it should be mentioned that the evolution towards liberal economic principles began when ayans, this is the Ottoman kind of bourgeois, led the trade relations with Europeans. Having analyzed the political economic formation of the Ottoman Empire, which experienced changes after intervention by external European capitalists and internal challenges, when Janissaries were supplanted by Ayans in the socio-economic life of empire through the Bill of Alliances agreement in 1808. At the same time, political power granted to Ayans transformed them into the important focus of the Ottoman socio-economic structure, which has continued with Tanzimat centralization process, modernization process, and Young Turks, as well as Abdulhamid era. The Kurdish social structure is, as we said, based on the kinship and tribal relations that are governed by custom, religious values, and divided into the different houses, which they call mals, which has basic political economic units. So the economic structure of the Kurdistan regions dominated by self-sufficient agriculture and livestock farming, where the mode of production is for local consumptions. Daily life is divided into nomadic existence and village life in a pastoral way. The tribal formation of society was crucial determinant of economic relations to the mode of production, and surplus within the market economy, reciprocity and redistribution through symmetry and centricity principle was embedded in tribal understanding of social phenomena. But as we said, when Ottoman didn't really want to keep this social structure and wants to these periphery of the Ottoman to be part of this transformation process, then things has been changed. The moral economy of the Kurds hasn't been really the case to keep it within the society. So in this case, what's happened, we employ the idea of double movement. What was the double movement? Because once the market economy was expanded, the society is responded to this. This is how exactly happened in the Kurdish society. The Kurds started reacted such expanding aim of the empire and the state, and therefore within the social protectionist values. That makes us also our thesis much different than the nationalist perspective, because we argue and we say that the Kurds rebel against the Ottoman Empire, and after this rebellion is going on during the modern Turkey, not because of the only nationalist consciousness or nationalist demands, because of the also protecting social values, social structures, and their moral economy. Against such as historical background, the establishment of the republic in the early 20th century resulted in a disappearance of the Kurdish leadership and the failure of the capitalist and modern political economy institution to develop along the industrialization, financialization, and nation state directly by the Kurds in Turkey. Because we said, absence of political leadership after the failure of the Kurdish resistance started from the Ottoman Empire, such as Baban, Badini, Ravandus, Bedirhan, Ubaydullah, Barzanji, and Milli Ashuret reactions has been failed, and also during the modern Turkey, early 1920s, Sheikh Said, Dersim, and Arat also part of this kind of reaction, which created hegemonic gap within the Kurdish society because society lost their leadership. Therefore, new state, the modern Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, replace and fulfill this hegemonic gap. Therefore, force the society be part of these new nation building process of the Turkish Republic. And then we cannot really talk about much about moral economy as well as political economy of Kurds, because there is no de facto autonomy anymore. The power relation has been shifted, and now Kurds depend on the state macroeconomy, and as well as centralized by state. There is no de facto autonomy anymore. Therefore, this is the kind of different story and different casework for us to consider, and as well as to analyze from the different perspective perhaps from the more political theory. Therefore, we brought in Gramsci into this narrative and continue our empirical studies from the hegemonic order, because hegemonic order based on the power relations and Polanyi's moral economy and double movement is not good enough to respond such as violence and as well as conflict in this case. I will end up here because, as I said, we will just bring into the modern republic, and hopefully in the future we can be there physically and discuss it, the continue of the story, what's happened after the modern republic has been established and how the relationship has been changed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Omer, for this very nice, thought-provoking exposition. And we give the floor to Asutay Mehmet for a critical assessment of the present.
Thank you very much, Professor Wahabi and Sahar, for inviting us and for having us here. It is good to be among friends, and it is good to revisit Omer's contribution to the Kurdish studies by providing an immense theoretical exposition. As Omer has gone through only a small part of his work, but even that is enough in terms of his immense nature, and as you mentioned, in terms of thought-provoking nature. I think an important, perhaps at the beginning, I should say, in the beginning of the book, I think it was in the first chapter, Omer refers to Ahmed Khani. Let me explain the sorrow of my story. Let me explain the sorrow of my heart in a story. So this has been a story indeed, a narrative, and Omer, in his book, goes through this particular narrative. Incidentally, of course, it is very interesting how our geography determines the way we think, and somehow Omer is picking up of Ahmed Khani from his hometown as the beginning of his story is indeed remarkable in terms of tracing the lines to the origin, where the story started, at least in Omer's case. Indeed, that sorrow in a political economy manner has been amazingly and in a very intense sense explored and exposed by Omer in this book. And therefore, my appreciation in terms of providing a theoretical perspective on the issues. I do recall the days when Omer looking into how to develop his research, and those days main research in the Kurdish areas were on the contemporary nature and based on mainly reporting what happens between different parts of the Kurdish struggles. But I think that wasn't satisfactory enough to contribute to the Kurdish studies. And therefore, Omer's engagement with particularly going into a theoretical formulation to understand, one, historically what happened, but of course, towards the end of the book, Omer moved into more contemporary times, hopefully which we can explore in the question and answer session. And therefore, the claim of constituting a political economy is the strength of Omer's book here. And that constituting is particularly important because when we look at studies, not only in the Kurdish case, but in the case of many communities who are resisting against the existing structures, one way or another, their political economies are always discussed in relation to the hegemonic political economies that exist in those societies. And therefore, in conflict, then those communities becomes, unfortunately, binary to the existing. And therefore, Omer's attempt here, in terms of going beyond that and going beyond those imposed boxes, but look into the micro dynamics and the foundations of a political economy. In other words, suggesting that, look, there is a story here, as mentioned in the beginning by referring to Ahmed Akhani, in an inner structure, whether the nationalists will call that, which prevented the development of a Kurdish state, or moral economists like myself would consider that as a source of resistance. But there is this particular inner dynamic, particular microstructure of a particular society, the Kurdish society. So therefore, of course, in the later chapters when discussing the Turkish Republic case, and that hegemony and counter-hegemony debate, one way or another has to deal with the existing political economy because of crushing of the Kurdish moral economy. But that at the essence, what we see, the emergent nature of a particular political economy, and by using different disciplinary approach, Omer identify the particularities of that political economy and the moral economy. And nowadays we refer to moral political economies. And here, what we see in the constitution of the Kurdish political economy, those microstructures in terms of a political economy and in terms of a moral economy existed in the Kurdish studies, and which provided an amazing strength for a resistance, because somehow, of course, in the contemporary period, in particular in relation to Kurdish issues, we consider resistance in terms of a political or the armed conflict. But what we see here, as Omer articulated, from the last part of the Ottoman Empire to the beginning of the Turkish Republic, those microstructures, what constituted the moral political economy of the Kurds, provided a source for an amazing resistance against imposed hegemony of a market system, but the consequent nature of that, that is the nation state, later the Turkish nation state. And therefore, aiming to, by bringing together these microstructures and constituting a political economy, we have to consider an important contribution beyond the binaries, because the easier route would have been considering the Kurds as a dependent of the existing political economy, such as the Ottoman or the later Turkish political economy. That will be a terribly relegationist approach. It could be a reductionist approach by entirely reducing Kurdish or the Kurdish society as a function of the other societies. However, here, rather than accepting such a theoretical formulation as well as the practical research, I'm always looking at the Kurdish issue in relation to the existing structures, and the contribution of Omer's book here is suggesting that no, beyond that, there is this micro foundation, and we are going to constitute a particular political economy. And hence my enjoyment of this work in this constitution of a political economy, suggesting that, look, Kurdish so-called underdevelopment is not necessarily because of the particular forces, whether external or internal, but by choice of resisting on keeping those moral economic structures in the late part of the Ottoman Empire and in the beginning of Republic, resulted in these circumstances that some calls it underdevelopment, but what we call is the moral economy nature of that society. Of course, considering how protection of human land and environment, as well as money, has become an important contemporary discourse through sustainable development, we understand that such resistance of insisting on the continuation of a particular moral economy played an important role in the I use the term development of the Kurdish societies, but of course the linearist modernists will consider an underdevelopment. But what is important, of course, here, that transformation that every nation has gone through, or the majority of the nations have gone through, and later, as Omer suggests, constituted imaginary societies, while Kurds had the necessary foundation to constitute a non-imaginary and perhaps a more realistic society because of these micro foundation that existed for over 1,000 years. They could not do that the transformation, and then the external forces, of course, plays an important role, as well as the internal dynamics which did not fit into the changed political economies of the external forces. In other words, what we see on the one hand, a constituted internal political economy of the Kurds, and then the changed nature of political economy globally, but as well as in the Middle East and in Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. And the inconsistencies emerged to the extent that the Kurds could not, of course, follow that transformation, or did not want to follow that transformation because of their internal construct, that moral economy. And again, I should insist that is not a failure, but looking at from today with all the sustainable development discourse, I think it's a value. However, that value, of course, resulted in such a case as we have seen over the last 100 years, the insecurity of the existence of humans, in addition to, of course, what happened to land and environment in the Kurdish regions. So by looking at from today, when we see the insecurity of human at the hand of the predatory states where the Kurds live, the question is whether the Kurds should have given up those moral economy values and shifted into the same trajectory and constituted their own. That is, I think, a question that we have been looking for an answer. But having said that, I'm still proud of the work that Omer brought to our attention, that this amazing dynamics of moral economy remained a point of resistance. Even in today's political economy, where the hegemony and counter-hegemony struggle continues, but still we can see, despite the expanded market economy imposed in the Kurdish regions, such as in Turkey, in particular since 1980s, as in every part of Turkey, but the marketization of the Kurdish and commodification of the Kurdish lives, as well as their everydayness, in particular with the evacuation of nearly 4,000 of villages. It is a political process, but at the same time, commodifying the life of these individuals and bringing them as a cheap labor to the market. That is an important part of the narrative that has been missed, making them as consumers, lower cost of the consumers in the metropolitan areas, while within their moral economies, they survived until those years. And therefore, looking at this modernist perspectives on how Kurds could not transfer as opposed to the moral economy, I think the duty was, and Omer has succeeded in that, is to reveal the nature of that political economy and the moral economy, systematizing that. Of course, we always made references to those micro foundations and the pillars, quite a number of studies, anthropologically and historically studies demonstrating the aghas and the sheikhs and the anthropologic nature of Kurdish societies, but bringing them together in a systematic manner and constituting that through a particular moral economy, I think is an important contribution of this piece. And therefore, interestingly also is a response to Weberian argument that the underdevelopment of the Muslim societies is very much related with religion and the capital accumulation, but suggesting that perhaps modernity is not necessarily the only way to look at societies. And hence, again, Omer's contribution here. In other words, societies can take up different trajectories. And just considering in an adversarian sense, because the modernist institutions and the modernist way of living is not prevailing in a particular society, calling those societies as underdevelopment, I think is not necessarily the best way of expressing the intellectual acumen that we are looking for. And therefore, Omer's response to that, perhaps within that post-colonial discourse of giving up the imposed boundaries in terms of the way we look at only from the modernist perspective, but locating that there were different dynamics and those societies survived. They created, as Omer used the term, created their own civilizations or sub-civilizations with their own institutions. That's an important story that has to be told. And I think Omer has successfully provided that. Of course, the sorrow remains there. The sorrow is there. It is inevitable because while the global political economy is changing, it creates an hegemony. And regardless of you want to remain within your moral economy, of course, the predatory nature of the state does not allow you and hence create hegemony. And therefore, from Polanyi shifting to Gramsci, looking into that hegemonic relationship and how the process of that relationship and the consequences as well of that relationship, again, is an important consequence to look into. And therefore, rather than in a reportive sense, going through which actors were on the ground and playing and creating conflict and responding to that conflict, rather than employing such a descriptive and very much reportive methodology, Omer's methodology, looking at that silent period of the Kurds in the initial parts of the Turkish Republic until 1960s, after the uprisings, in particular Sheikh Said uprising, again is an important contribution. And in the sense that bringing Polanyi and Gramsci in the same equation and explaining a social reality and the political development, I think that part really excites me, and it's an important contribution to the existing literature. And there are a couple of studies I have seen doing that, but in particular in the Kurdish case, Omer has achieved that fantastically. Of course, in the later part of the book, bringing social constructivism in a radical sense and expanding the analysis is an important challenge. On the one hand, Polanyi, then bringing Gramsci, and on top of that, adding radical social constructivism, and bring all these three together. It might create confusion in one's mind when you see all this, but we can see that how in a very intellectually established manner, they all fit into each other to explain the trajectory of the Kurdish political economy from a moral economy, then the hegemony, then socially constructing this new resistance, how moral economy was the source of resistance, how then in the later period, how creating counter-hegemony became the source of resistance, and then how within the so-called democratic era, socially constructing again the resistance. So what remains at the core? Resistance. But the strategies, of course, have changed from one period to another, and theoretically being able to explain that resistance is an important part. Of course, predatory nature of state in general, but in particular in the Middle East remains, and the resistance remains. Different ways we express, but what is important at the same time, and perhaps a sorrow, the new part of the sorrow is how with the imposed modernity and the market economy through neoliberalism, how the institutions of that moral economy in the Kurdish periphery is slowly diminishing and slowly disappearing, and the uniqueness of the Kurdish political economy and the convergence with the Turkish center in terms of the express attitudes within the modernity, or in the case of Iran, with the conversion towards Tehran center, and perhaps a small hope in the South Kurdistan, an enclave, and hopefully in Syria. Those enclaves perhaps would be the new expression, at least in Syria, a new expression of moral economy, and hopefully new ways of expressing this resistance again through moral economy will be important. And therefore, despite the fact that within modern understanding, those institutions of moral economy has been considered as the hindrance of the transformation of society, but I still believe that they are the strength. They were the strength, and they are the strength, and they will be the strength of the Kurdish moral economy, and keeping the society intact, and also providing an important dynamic for the sustainability of the Kurdish identity, and hence that convergence that we are witnessing, how that can be interrupted by insisting on those institutions, whatever the source of those institutions. But as Omer pointed out, those micro foundations of that moral economy, of that political economy, is important for us to identify, to essentialize, and hopefully to work on them to ensure that they are passed from one generation to the new, but they can be examined theoretically and academically to bring them to light, as those distinctions are important. By saying that, of course, I'm not suggesting that societies by definition should be distinct. History, one way or another, evolved through blending. Each society, each civilization borrowed from one to other. But what was important in that historical development of blending, there wasn't an hegemony. No one imposed a particular hegemony. Now we have global hegemony. That's the market system. So it forces commodification of everything around us. But then the political economies of in each state in which Kurds have been living. And hence the different levels of hegemony is now forcing the Kurdish societies to converge. However, by referring, therefore bringing into the light the foundational base, the micro foundation of that political economy, and reminding us that there is this particular source of resistance. And that's an important contribution of this book that I have to congratulate Omer in bringing to our attention. The time is an issue, therefore I'm not going to go further, but perhaps Omer can explain to us perhaps a bit more detail, because he couldn't go into how in this contemporary times in particular, Omer in later part, as I mentioned, looked into radical social constructivism as the third methodological frame used. And looking at, unfortunately, the debates, intellectual as well as the practical debates around radical democracy has terribly been diminished. And how do we consider now, after we have written this book? Of course, first, if you can provide us an understanding, those colleagues who haven't had the chance to read your book, to understand that connotation to the sustainability of the Kurdish identity within the opportunity space that you are identifying in the book, so that colleagues can hear. But at the same time, as a post-published book now, how do you see that radical democracy in terms of sustaining that opportunity space that identified in the book? I think that will be good to hear that. The other issue, of course, in the later part, the European Union process and its impact on creating an additional opportunity space together with the expanded expanded and contracted Turkish democracy, of course, that's an issue. But why do you think that institutional? Because the way I looked at when I was reading again, I think this essentialization of European Union as an institution, rather than the qualities of the European, because as an institution, European Union has its own difficulties, challenges, and the boundaries as well, and the underlying difficulties. So rather perhaps the spirit of the European Union in terms of essentializing the human security and human rights and freedoms, rather than considering the EU as an institution. And so rather than an institutional approach, perhaps a substance approach, do you think would have been a better approach to take up in that part of the chapter? Or do you still think that that institutional approach is an important part? I'll finish with that, as we mentioned, the resistance in that moral economy, I think, is an exciting story that Omer brought to our attention. Of course, in recent years, in particular, I think in the last 2 years, I've seen a couple of papers as well came out in terms of looking at the so-called smugglers and the moral economy. I think there was the case between Turkey and the Iranian case, if I'm not mistaken. These are exciting stories, and I'm hoping that Omer's contribution will lead to further colleagues within the Kurdish studies to take up more theoretical pieces and contribute to our understanding of the internal dynamics, the micro foundations of the Kurdish society, regardless of the hegemony and counter hegemonies that we have to fight with. We have to learn as well the internal dynamics of that society. And therefore, looking at from that perspective, again, referring to Ahmed Arif's famous poem on the 33 bullets, indeed, as part of that moral economy, therefore, we have not got used to the passports and the borders that has been erected around us, because that moral economy connects different parts of the Kurdish societies one way or another. And I'll stop there, and love to hear from other colleagues as well as Omer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehmet. Thanks to Mehmet, we have a better grasp of the perspective opened by the book of Omer and a richer understanding of what is offered in this book. But Omer, if you have a response to questions raised at the end of Mehmet's intervention, you have 5 minutes. Then we will pass, to the floor. And please, Sahar, help me in case if I, do not take sight enough of the people who wish to participate. I catch a cold, and sometimes I am not completely concentrated.
Sure.
Omer, we hear you, your response for 5 minutes, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Asutay. It was a very positive response. I'm not quite sure how can I respond to that positiveness. As we said, the story will be continue after the political economy. So what we were trying to say, the political economy side of the work, the book, it was a great kind of foundation for to understand the constructing of the modern Kurdish political identity, and as well as political struggle of the today. So end of the political moral economy, at least by controlling the Kurdish leadership, brought us into the hegemonic relations, and as well as new actors has been emerged, especially after the rebellions part of the book. There are kind of, what Hamid Bozorgson says, silent years. The Kurds was actually waiting to understand what exactly happened to them, and as well as without leadership, for a while, they couldn't really move. And so emerging of the 50s, a new modern, the Turkish state's democratization process, and as well as engaging with the Western countries such as NATO and European Union. Therefore, it creates sort of opportunity space for the Kurds to be involved again to the politics of the state. Their population give them advantage. They became as a source of votes. They became very important for the certain political parties of the Turkey. So they had a chance again, slowly but slowly restructuring the Kurdish identity in a modern sense by using different tools and state apparatus. So they use the social media, medias, they use the parliament, political parties, but not their own. 60s, 70s give them, opportunity to organize under the leftist idea, bring in new modern organizations rather than leadership anymore. Is now the Kurdish politics mostly institutionalized. They are organizing around the political organizations and struggle shifted mostly from traditional way into the modern secular and as well as leftist idea. So these struggles continue for a while until Turkey's democratic system always has been interrupted by the coup, and certain coups always they interrupted. 60s, 70s wave in the world also that affected Turkey, and then 1980 coup in Turkey unfortunately demolished all these kind of semi freedom of the organizations. And then emergence of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and as well as re-employing, let's say, the armed struggles. So the conflict again shaped within the violence and within the armed struggles, resistance again, reappearance in this way. And then they obviously started fight against Turkish security armed forces from 1979, but most effectively 1982 till to the present in a low level. But then the opportunity space, as Professor Asutay mentioned it, having and seeing European Union as a representative of the liberal values, give them also the opportunity to use their own political parties, civil organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs. And therefore, they start to realize there is another way of the resistance. So on the one hand side, there was armed struggles happening against the Turkish state to demanding their democratic rights, national rights, including linguistic. And then on the other hand, they started, first of all, involve the party, the macro party in Turkey, but then they started to organize their own pro-Kurdish political parties in the parliament, and then use the parliamentarian politics to be involved Turkish politics in order to requested some sort of national requests. So this parliamentarian politics give them some sort of opportunity. And then, as we said, this is the identity politics. We don't really give up from the hegemony, from the Gramsci still, but we are saying the hegemonic relation is not going to be good enough to understand this identity politics. As you can imagine, I also employ Laclau and Mouffe using the new movements and how the new movements emerge with within the hegemonic movement. Therefore, I rely on hegemony while using the social constructivism as an approach. So this also brought me into the understanding of how really the Kurdish movement started using the idea of the radical democracy, and as well as very recently employing the left-wing populist party as a way of struggle, and in order to transforming these existence democratic system in a way of passive revolution. So as you can see, on the one hand, they are using the armed struggle, which is aiming to have a direct revolution, to change the system by force, by coercion, so kind of response to the coercion and oppression of the state. But on the other hand, they use passive revolution, which is the transformation of the existing system through a parliamentarian system by using left-wing populist party, which is we are seeing all around the world in a different cases in a global context, in Latin America, in Greece and Spain, Syriza, Podemos, so on and so forth. So this is how I can end up here. And then I leave it to you and hopefully we can discuss it further through the questions. So I don't want to talk to more and keeping your time. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Omer. Please, if anyone wants to raise a question or to comment, please leave your name on the chat. Sahar and I will take care of it to give a turn. There will be 2 turns for questioning or commenting. The first is now open, 4 or 5 people, and then if there is time, we will be having also a second round. Now, for the first round, is there anybody? I do not see any name appearing on the screen in the chat part. If there is no question or comment, I will start, of course.
Yeah.
Or Sahar will always.
No, you can start, and after you, I have a question too, and I ask Omer my question.
Okay. Now, there are 2 people on the list. Is there any other we can take for the first round, 3, 4 at least?
Sure, or if you want, you can write the question in the chat
Yes.
box and we can read it.
Okay, I start, and we will see whether the other ones will join us to raise questions. At the start, we are all a little bit shy, but little by little things change. Okay, I really enjoyed the presentation because there is a novelty, an original idea. I think usually we say that if Kurdistan in Iran, I take as a part of the story, and I am familiar about, to some extent, about the Iranian economy, political economy. We usually say that if in Kurdistan, there was a period, a very long period of feudalism. And even after, the land reform in the Shah's period, in the 60s, Shah did not push to advance, reform, land reform in the Kurdistan area. And in fact, Shah was very concerned about the way the elite, and by elite in Iranian Kurdistan, I mean the big family, landlord families, who were the chief of the tribes, how would they react of this change? Okay, now, the interpretation we lent to this change was not that Kurdish people wanted to reject capitalism or market. The interpretation was twofold. One interpretation put the emphasis on a kind of alliance between the Shah's regime and big landowners, and the Shah didn't want politically and strategically to degrade the situation, to deteriorate the situation. So they, in fact, avoided, land reform. And in this sense, it was a kind of, that this interpretation was not nationalistic, because we were, emphasizing the fact that part of the Kurdish society, namely the big names of landowners, I know many of them. Personally, I know them, and I have had many, many discussions with them personally. Some of them are, party leaders of big party of Kurdistan, in a struggle now with the Islamic Republic of Iran. One of them, Mr. Muhtadi. That was the first interpretation. And there was a second interpretation also formulated by the left, but also nationalist tendencies. And that was the idea of Untergrund Frank, uneven and combined development, and the marginalization. That means that marginalization exists. We have periphery and metropole, not only at an international level, but also inside the countries where there are minority ethnic groups. So Kurdistan, like Baluchistan, like Turkmen Sahra, and like part of the south of Iran, they are, suffering from a double repression, not only political and ideological repression, but a kind of chauvinism Persian chauvinism, Iranian chauvinism, but also economically speaking. Now, in this context, the fact that we have not manufacturers, a lot of manufacturers or industrialization in Kurdistan was not interpreted as something wished by the Kurdish people. It was considered as a kind of repression or a kind of domination of the Iranian chauvinistic attitude since Reza Khan. Okay, predatory state, but in this way. What I find, and I am even now twice interested in reading Omer, and Mehmet helps me to have more even degustation taste for it, is that you are saying that at least in under the Ottoman Empire, it was not because there was a repression, but it was a rejection by the Kurdish people to maintain a moral economy. Okay, that I note, I need to understand more and learn more about it. Now, after emphasizing this point, I have two questions from the Polanyi side. The first, and these questions seem conceptual, theoretical, but they are not really only theoretical because they have important implications. The first one is about the notion of mode of production. I do not think that Polanyi used mode of production, but mode of transaction. And by mode of transaction, he meant social form of integration. It is really different from what Karl Marx named mode of production, okay? Because in your discourse, in your presentation, usually you used indifferently mode of production and Polanyi's framework. Whereas I think these are two different things. And the important thing, what comes out of this distinction is that, for example, when we refer to a mode of transaction, it is a form of social integration, as you said, but it doesn't clarify whether we have, for example, a feudal mode of production or not. Okay. Whereas in Karl Marx, the first thing is that what is the economic at a production level exploitation for? Now, in case of Iran, for example, during the land reform, it's very important because moral economy in the context of landlordism is a little bit like a resistance but coexistence with a feudal system. James Scott has many nice books on the story of moral economy. Moral economy is not necessarily very nice. Moral economy is part of sometimes feudal system. And you know, the expectation peasants have towards their landlords. So they should be, you know, with capitalism, there is no expectation from wage salary groups towards capitalists. But previous to that, in pre-capitalist mode of production, there was a bond, a personal bond. Capitalism is marked with impersonal markets, and not only market, impersonal market. In between the parentheses, I would say that Polanyi was not so clear. Brodel was much clearer between archaic markets or bazaar, which is personal, where the price is not regulating force, and impersonal market, which is the new market. A stock exchange is the archetype of this market, in which, you know, you dissociate, you know, tribal society, collective groups, we create individualization. But the good thing is that it is not just a cohesion between a small group. It opens to the whole world. Impersonal market creates the possibility of globalization and to not have, you know, only proximity with your tribe, with the bloody ties, the blood ties. Okay, now, what we have in the moral economy? Can we idealize moral economy? Or should it be considered, if we look into it from a Marxist perspective, as some kind of justification or prolongation of landlordism? Okay, I understand that moral economy, and I do not use the same term, for upchins in Russia, when there was communal form of, peasant work, was used by Karl Marx himself to be a kind of way to detour the capitalist system to go directly to socialism. It was at least an assumption which was raised. Okay. Now, if I look into the relationship in Kurdistan, Iran, Kurdistan, the amount of, communal form of ownership is very marginal compared to private property. Now, moral economy, is it really something that can be opposed to landlordism, or is it a way to prolong it? This is my first question about the story of moral economy. I have a very quick second question, and I finish with that. In fact, is that when we look into Kurdistan, Iran, Kurdistan, we have a mountainous part of Iran, which is Kurdistan. And we have books by James Scott. I think it can be applied to Iranian Kurdistan. And I had some exchange of view with him on this respect. And he is completely agree that the Iranian Kurdistan can be considered as what he called barbarian versus civilized. And he's proponent, he's an advocate of barbarian, if you call it barbarian, mountainous, okay? And I think that Iranian Kurds showed that they have a great military force. They can be, resistant to state making. Although, and Sahar knows better than me, that there were some important reaction like Cumhuriyet Mahabad Republic, that the Kurds wanted to create a confederation and create some sort of state. Okay, but there were repellents towards, predatory state in general, and they could resist. Now, Kurdish integration perhaps was not so much from the economic point. I leave it open. Where did it come? Was it their choice or was it imposed? But it is true that Kurdish could integrate as a strong military force, and including, after the demise of Ottoman Empire, they kept it in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, and any others. Can we say that even if economically it was not integrated, the integration happened through military system or from a state building process? These are my two questions. Sorry to be so long, but I didn't see, people still asking for their turn. I spoke much more that I was very lengthy. Sahar, please.
Yes.
Yours. We will gather 3-4 questions.
Okay.
For if there is after Sahar, there are other people who are there for the first round, and then we will give the floor to Omer to respond. Sahar, please.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Mehmet, for your remarks and for the points you raised about the Kurdish political economy in Iran, and of course for the case in Turkey. We have I want to add that we have a question in the chat. There's someone who has the same name, Mehmet. So I asked my questions. I have also 2 questions, and then I can read the question in the chat. Thank you so much, Omer. It was a great presentation, and certainly what distinguishes your works from the others is that you that you focused on the internal dynamics of the Kurdish society. But what is important, another factor which is important as well, is that especially in modern era, the capitalism and the nation state characterize the modern age, and both factors are of course external to the Kurdish society. But my question is, as you insist on the constituting the political economy of the Kurds, is that could we give the most significant weight to the internal factors in the construction of the political economy of the Kurds, especially in modern era? And if you want to start to analyze the role of the state, especially, how we can theoretically, I mean, study the role of the state in constituting the political economy of the Kurds. And I add another question, sorry, maybe it's too much, but how you explain the uneven development of the Kurds in Turkey in Polanyian mode of integration framework? We have another question. Should we read them, or you prefer to answer to Mehmet and me, and then to other questions?
I think, Sahar, also these two questions, can be included for the first round, and then we will open the second round. If the two questions, as I see,
yes.
The first one is from Mehmet also. Given the sociological similarity of Armenian and Kurdish society, why not Armenian becomes part of the resistance, which you described as a counter movement, even though the market system was a threat for their own social values and modes of production too, similar to Kurdish case? Is there any particular drive behind these behavioral differences? And we have also from Dr. Ukjan Goskel as another question or comment. Dear Omer and Mehmet Asutay, Hokam, many thanks to both of you for this enlightening event. Has been a great introduction to Omer's book and Polanyi's political economy vision overall. Now I need to leave for, okay, that's just, okay, that was just a kind
yes.
departure. Is there any other question? No. Okay, please, Omer, you, and in the meanwhile, if there are for a second round, please write your name. We have till 4:30 p.m. time to continue the discussion. I suggest, Omer, to take 10 minutes to answer, because there were many questions.
Sure. I'm going to combine all these questions together, I suppose, because more or less the question is quite similar way to indicate the argument of the book. So what we say is the question on the chat, starting from question on the chat and then comes to your questions, the why this is not the case for Armenians or Albanians or Arabs, why the Kurds? So there's a two-way to respond to this question, and as well as to challenge the explanation of whether they're Muslim. If they were Muslim because they belong to Islam, then why it wasn't case for the Albanians and Arabs? Why for the only Kurds? And if it's not, then they were in the same geography with Armenians, and why Armenians managed to, complete their transformation process? Why Kurds failed? Obviously, we said, we are keeping external dynamics, the role of the superpowers, Russians, British Empire, even the Kurdish, projects, Mahabat projects has been failed because of the Russian involvement in the region, because of the geopolitics of the region, and Kurdish geography and positions within the Middle East, led them to this kind of things. But this is outcome of these non-transformation process. That's why we're saying, we're not saying, oh, because of this has happened, because of the external powers is involved, then that's why they didn't have any nation state. We are actually reading the different way and bringing questions from the from the end, saying that, look, they didn't transfer, they insist to keeping their traditional social structure, their way of life, self-sufficient economy, tribal economy, not be integrated into the industrialization process, not creating, this is the economic side of it, right? Not be part of these economic production process, whatever transmission process that you mentioned it, because when I use the mode of production, because I've tried to always respond to the modernist approach to saying that why they didn't actually create their the mode of the production in a way of the capitalist system, because of their understanding of producing. For instance, I give example in the book. I'm saying, look, they were producing the cottage cheese, but they never thought this cottage cheese could be source of income. They were producing for their own benefit, for their own, it was self-sufficient house economy. So they didn't think about expanding economic system within the region, be part of the first imperial market economy, secondly, international market economy. So their way of the living, the mountain regions is also quite effective on this case, and is also always helping them to create and to protect their de facto autonomy since Byzantine time. Roman and the Byzantium and Seljuks and Ottoman, they never ever controlled this region. There was always de facto autonomy of the Kurds. There is this famous motto of the Kurds saying, we don't have friends but mountains, right? So this is how they protected their social structure and responsibility. So they rejected because they didn't need it. So these new project of the 19th century, modernization, industrializations, nation states, wasn't really something they really will and they want to be part of it. So that doesn't mean, they're not at the moment, because as I said, once they realize this one, that makes, Kurdish case different than the other Armenian, Arabs, the other nations in the regions, because they prefer to stay within their own territory, because they were always having this flexibility to control their own internal territory, a sort of sovereignty, and external dynamics. And also, I didn't have a chance to say, there are important characteristics of the Kurdish leadership and as well as society is sometimes much, much important than the external dynamics. Like the Agas or Emirates honor, pride. This why we utilize the anthropological tools to look at the, in a Polanyian way, sociological, anthropological, and ethnographic way of the Kurdish society, saying that, look, sometimes Aga's honor not to be part under another Aga's control was much important than the external power's domination on the society. So you cannot really be under your own society's, Agas, but you prefer to be under the Ottoman Empire or Turkish modern Turkey. So therefore, this kind of lack of integrations to the modernity, because this is not fit with the modern civilization. This is a different civilization. That's why we're trying to highlight it. There is a different civilization which is not fit with the modernity. Consider about Japanese civilization, Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, so many other different civilization, indigenous. So they are coming from different root and understanding. So that's the reason why they rejected and they missed the opportunity. Once world order has been established, nation state replaced the empire, multiculturalism replaced by homogenic nationalism, homogenic nation citizenship. Therefore, they realized, oh, we missed the opportunity. And when they realized they missed the opportunity, then they reacted. So these modern rebellions comes in, especially in Turkey, between early 20s and 30s. Even you see in Iran and Iraq, until the Saddam era, those rebellions, and today Syria even, against Assad. So all these rebellions comes from these roots. They still want to be part of. Now they reject it, But when they realized they missed the opportunity, because they missed the opportunity, they became subject of the genocide, torture, displacement, and as well as internal colonizations process, and be forced be part of the macro nations, whether Arab, Turkish, or Persian. Then they said, oh, we want to be part of this modern system because this is how it works. So now let's demand it, let's go back. But the game, the rule of the game has been established long time ago, and the external powers, superpowers, who actually created this game, created this order, didn't want to even the Kurds to destroy what they establish in the region and as well as in a macro context. So until a couple of years ago, this is the big pictures. Until a couple of years ago, in Iraqi Kurdistan, they didn't have a banking system. So the social relations, your reputation, this homo economicus, the tribal identity hasn't been replaced, has not forced to Kurds became part of this homo economicus, because they were always the social reputation or tribal relations or promise much important, sometimes more than contract and so on and so forth, or other type of the structural relation. So this informality was always much important than some of the modern institutions. But that doesn't mean they're not transforming, because they're transforming, because they are forced to be transformed because of the country, the state they lived in. So that's the things why still smuggling is the case for the Kurds. Still, as Professor Asutay mentioned it, they don't recognize these artificial borders in their geographical territory. So therefore, they are not smuggling, they are actually doing business with their cousins in other side of the borders. So this is how they see, this is how the passport or visa is meaningless for them. I hope this kind of responds to your questions. Maybe Professor Asutay wants to say something to respond that. You are mute, Professor.
I think the trajectory of development between Kurds and Armenian has been different also by looking at the repression, the nature of repression as well. When you look at, for instance, Ayşe Bura's book on state and business in Turkey, she goes back to the earlier time as well, talking about how the young Turks were attempting to Turkify the business, the emerging industry, for instance. And in that Turkification, of course, Muslimness still was part of the imagined new order. And therefore, Kurds were not subjected to same plundering as the Armenians. And the Kurdish mainly repression comes in the second wave of imagined community, because the new wave of imagined community excluded non-Turkishness as well. But in the initial part, it was the Muslimness of the Kurds kept them in the Turkish imagination, or the young Turks' imagination, within the acceptable imagined community, and therefore Armenians were excluded by definition. And therefore appropriation or expropriation of their land as well as their wealth was subjected to the process of repression and nature of the predatory state. And therefore that has forced that external nature of the emerging new political economy within the Ottomans that immediately excluded the non-Muslims within this new imaginary society, and therefore Armenians were forced into new forms of existence, such as in Armenia, or unfortunately perished in the process. And therefore the trajectory is different. But what would be interesting, which unfortunately I haven't come across anything else, what would be interesting, like as Omer has done it, whether when the emergence of the Armenian state or under the Soviet Russia and existence appeared, what was the nature of the organization of that society? Can we locate similar moral economies, or because under the communism, the society one way or another had to leave the moral economies, but whether they have become part of this emerging industrial society in a similar way, but essentialization, of course, with the communist order. I think that would have give us an important indication whether the continuation of the moral economy continued in their new existence. Of course, this important sector of the Armenians from the Kurdish region disappeared, unfortunately, perished. But what happened in this new emergence in Armenia, whether that continued or not, that would be an interesting study. And therefore, one of my expectations is that Omer's contribution perhaps can pave the way for similar communities to look into their internal dynamics and constituting a political economy in their peripheries, beyond being binary to the centers, whatever that center, whether Moscow, whether such as in the case of Palestinians, Israel, or the Baluchis, Pakistan or Iran, or Kashmiris. That would be interesting to look into, because most of the studies analyze their political economies in relation to responding to the center, repression of the center, but the internal dynamics. Therefore, that will be interesting. But understanding that trajectory of difference, I guess we have to look into the initial imaginary society by the Young Turks, and later by the Kemalists, the new imaginary society, the exclusion. Initial exclusion was the non-Muslims, then the second wave of exclusion was the non-Turks. So that's an interesting way of looking at that, I would say. I guess there were some important theoretical issues raised by Professor Wahabi. I don't know whether, Omer, do you want to respond to them?
You are muted, Omer.
I was just expecting for the second round of the questions, whether there are any other questions or not, and then perhaps maybe we could, use the remaining times to respond to this theoretical. Yeah.
Yes, I have few responses as well. Okay, I'll follow you.
I'm going to leave it to you, I suppose.
A question: is there any other questions or comments for the second round? Because we have almost 7 minutes left. Yeah. Is there any question or no? There isn't. I just give a short announcement for the next session and then give the floor to Omer and Mehmet if they have comments to add. The level is too high for me, but I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all. That's Nicolas. He said it. Thanks a lot, Nicolas, for this nice, comment. And just one thing, next session will be February 18th. Of course, Mehmet and Omer, you will receive our announcements for seminars systematically.
I will be happy.
From the time, really. We will be very happy to have your feedback. All the present also are, included. If you are not in the list, you can give your name to Jonathan for, we have a central list who are regularly.
Do include us, please.
Thank you very much. And the next session is on February 18. It is really about predatory states and state predation or central state predation in post-socialist countries, especially Hungary, Russia, and also in Czechia, the tendency which is called as illiberal democracy.
Yes.
There are two, Balint Magyar and Milodovic, Balint Milodovic and Balint Magyar, who was, previous minister of culture in Hungary, but he came out of the government when the Feds government was installed, Viktor Orban, and he is a very well-known sociologist also, an economist, sociology of economy. And there will be their paper, and their paper will be circulated on this issue that will be discussed for this region of the world. I want also, before giving the the floor to both guests of us, thank them really deeply. Especially, I would have to say that Middle East in France is not very well known. Lebanon is an exception.
Yes.
We have not real research contrary to Anglo-Saxon countries. And I think this is one of the missing link in the development studies in France. The Middle East, we talk a lot about the dangers of political Islam, but we do not talk enough about what is Middle East and what is North Africa, or the countries which are involved. If we do understand better those countries, we may have a better understanding of this, Islamization and other stuff. Okay, I will be quiet, silent, and the floor is yours. You give your comments, and we will say afterward goodbye.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of you, and I'll leave it to Professor Asutay. Perhaps he wants to say something. Really appreciate that. And I'm also he said illiberal democracy. I'm also working on my second book on illiberal democracy by comparing Turkey, Russia, Venezuela, and as well as India. So yes, because one of the research topics that I work on is populism, right-wing populism, left-wing populism, and that will be very interesting for me to join your event as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Omer. I think I should start with one correction. We did not imply, neither of us, I think, that there wasn't a repression. And repression, of course, was there. But within the Ottoman system, perhaps until the emergence of Abdülhamit II, the repression wasn't central. So they used different means of repressions and coercion. And therefore, the importance of the Gramscian approach, even historically looking at the issues. So repression were mainly localized repressions through through the instructions of the center. But with the Abdülhamit II, the centralization of repression starts, and therefore even the Islamic scholars of the time, they very much rejected Abdülhamit II's position, and one of the, of course, leading opponents were Said Nursi, the Islamic scholar again from Kurdistan, and therefore, because that brought the whole modern centralized understanding of ruling. Now, the nation state, emergence of the nation state and the centralized power, but they wanted to implement that centralized power within an empire. And that, of course, accumulated the nature of repression. And therefore, the Kurdish rejection is the protection of the social formation of the Kurds, because they wanted to keep that moral economy. So on the one hand, protection. On the other hand, that protection provided an opportunity for them to reject the emerging nature of centralized governance, but at the same time, with the Young Turks, impose market economy. So therefore, it played two roles. Repression is there, the changing nature of repression, but then the rejection is very much protection and rejection that ways. On your issue, of course, rightly you have identified the modes of production issue, as we borrowed from and enjoy from Marxian theoretical frame. And however, in the moral economy, as you mentioned, it is very much on the transaction side, not necessarily on the production side. That's perhaps what is implicit, perhaps in this analysis, my take up as well as Omer's take up. Recently, I do not know whether you have come across new ways of expressing moral political economies. And this moral political economy, although I haven't named it in my work, and Omer did not name it in the book, but is an implicit. And in that implicitly, one way or another, perhaps Omer contributed to that, the emergence of a moral political economy, although didn't claim it. So in that one, on the one hand, the behavioral norms is a moral economy. On the other hand, the expectation is the behavioral norms leading to structures. So those structures then establishes your political economy. Behavior is the moral economy part. And that moral economy, of course, you have certain institutions representing that moral economy, but then the structures, those institutions are structuralized to constitute a political economy. And therefore, when we talk about, when Omer was going through his expression of the initial part of the book, in a way, it's a moral political economy. So it therefore, the references to modes of production, but at the same time, the social transactions and the social formation in the same. How social is the articulation of that political economy or the social formation or the modes of production within that. Of course, modes of production is very much relates to industrial societies. And therefore, perhaps we could say that, look, how that will apply to the Kurdish society of the time. But regardless of that, when we talk about the modes of production, at the same time, what we imply and what, of course, the Marxism imply as well is the organization of society around resources. And regardless of whether, so in our case, we do not have industrial society, but still you have resources, regardless of the nature of that resources and how society organizes around those resources. And therefore, that gives us the way of organizing a modes of production, because you are defining the roles. You are defining who is Agha, who is a landowner, who is working in the land, who is looking after the animals, and who is looking at the children. So you are defining all those, and therefore you are in a way defining a modes of production even in a non-industrial society. And therefore, I think what Omer wanted to, and which I really liked it, and therefore that is my work as well, going beyond the imposed very rigid constraints of the theories. And therefore, looking into some, of course, might claim that this is very eclectic, because if you look at it from one theoretical perspective, then it sounds eclectic. But what the claim is here that social reality should not be compartmentalized. Social reality is happening in its fullness. And therefore, in order to be able to capture that fullness, we cannot just use compartments to explain a certain part and then cannot explain the other part. And therefore, that transdisciplinarity, on the one hand, we use the theoretical explanation, whether Marxism, whether Gramscian, whether social constructivism and Polanyian, of course, you have their essences remains around, but bringing them together provides us an opportunity to deal with our own essence. Hence, that transdisciplinarity, I think, is an important part, and therefore, interchangeably, not necessarily interchangeably, but behaviors leading to structure, behaviors within the institutions leading to structures, and therefore that was the take-up perhaps implicitly, and it wasn't explained in detail because of the time issue. And therefore, from that, going to your rightly position, because when I talk about moral economy, just the anecdote, I had some English students in the class from the northern part of UK, which suffered a lot under the Industrial Revolution. And he could not restrain himself, but he said that, look, when you look at the moral economy times, we were terribly suffering, but look at life is much better. But of course, there's an exchange, and there's an exchange. In order to have this comfort, you have given certain things up, okay, including by having a credit card, you have lost your dependence. Sorry, you lost your independence, for instance. So those are important factors to consider. But having said that, of course, I fully agree with how moral economy worked in societies like us, but in most of the other societies as well, when we look at Latin America, as well as South Asia, one way or another worked within the existing sub-hegemonies of landlords. That's a reality. However, that is not necessarily, this is an argument I'm putting forward, this is not necessarily the nature or the quality of moral economy. Because moral economy, by its nature, rejects hegemony. But unfortunately, the way it emerged in the existing societies, in one way or another, the hegemonies imposed themselves and left the microstructures to operate, and hence behavioral, but they did not allow even the landlords creating hegemony, they did not allow those behavioral norms resulting into structures to change the existing structures, such as landlords. And therefore, I wish we had more time and the face-to-face to discuss this, but the moral economy, therefore, by or essentializes the landlord or gave the power to hegemony, it is because it did not allow, it was not allowed to create its own structures as a result of its own behaviors. Unfortunately, therefore, when we look at from today, we can easily claim that, well, moral economy at the end of the day worked within the hegemony as well. And that sounds, but I think the nature of it, when we look at the nature and the whole ideological position of moral economy is rejection of hegemony, establishing that equilibrium in the society, and that term is very much important, establishing equilibrium between different stakeholders in the society, rather than the hegemonic relationship. And that is, that kind, although Polanyi unfortunately did not go into detail because he was just observing how the moral economy was working, rather than normatively suggesting how it should have been. So he didn't go into that. But when we look at, for instance, in recent years, there were a couple of books looking at within different religious practices as well, in the West, how the moral economy was working, and therefore that nature of non-hierarchy. I mean, just came to my mind. I don't know, some of you might be familiar, like Khalil Gibran's work. In one of his fantastic fables, he goes through an example, a shepherd in Lebanon. He takes his animals, but at one point he goes into sleep, and when he wakes up, he finds himself imprisoned. And then later, a monk comes, and when he sees the monk, he says, "What happened?" And they tell him that, well, you were taking your animals to the land of the church. Then he gets puzzled. What do you mean the land of the church? And they say, look, this is our territory. This belongs to the church. Then he says, well, all the land belongs to God. And you are supposed to be representing God. How then high you have the territory? So that's the moral economy, the establishment of territories, unfortunately. In particular, in the later part, the territories, of course, emerged. Now we increase those territories. Now our flats, our homes, even our rooms, we created all those different territories. I think historically, therefore, the emergence of territories has been an important challenge to moral economy. And because moral economy was not political economy, was not allowed to be political economy, it couldn't create the necessary, it was not allowed to create the necessary structures to respond to the emerging hegemonies. I think that will be my take up on that. Hopefully we can discuss perhaps, but thank you for taking up on this, the market. So certainly in a moral economy, when we discuss moral economy, I identify as well as you have done, market as a space and market as a system. So that distinction is important because market is a space where we come together, we do the exchange, and none of us hegemonic, and that space doesn't have an external rule that is imposed. Our social relationships determine, and therefore Bourdieu's definition of price does not determine anything, but everything determines price. Again, we owe to the French for that. So Bourdieu's definition of that price, the emergence of price, because it happens in the space through the social relations, and therefore it cannot determine everything, but everything determines price. And that's the market. However, market as a system, of course, which we have been facing, and unfortunately that distinction is important, in particular with the emergence of labor market, for instance, in Turkey. Since 1960s, similar things, of course, in the Iranian part, how this commodification of labor as well in the market system. I always give an example. In the village life, people used to help each other because they were part of that community. Then later, that relationship in responding to the emerging market-based political economy, that relationship turned into, well, I will come to help you in your harvest, but in return, I would expect you come to me. So that transformed into that. In the third level, what had happened? Well, I'll come to help you in the harvest, but this is my wage. Because there's a market now, labor market emerged, and therefore everyone has an opportunity cost. Unfortunately, that happened in the Kurdish regions as well, in similar thing in Iran and Turkey, in all the nation states. Therefore, the uneven development that we are referring, again, thanks to French literature, of course, that uneven development, unfortunately, when it was leveling, it was undermining those qualities. So on the one hand, there is a process of leveling. Yes, each one of you will come a laborer now. You are a commodity now. So we are leveling you. You are all laborer now. But in that process, of course, you are losing the quality of being a moral person in your own realm. So that's an important as well response to uneven development. We always refer to uneven, but because the center, the way center takes up development is not necessarily the best center that we want to be converged. Unfortunately, that is the market system. So the convergence and leveling up the rest of the society, what it does, it brings everyone to the market system now. And it has on its rules and regulation. Therefore, today, when you go to the Kurdish villages as well, you have to talk about the money, unlike the good old days. So because that convergence leveled up now, whether we are happy now, the uneven development is being achieved, that's a question that we have to pose in response to that. But the distinction on market as a space and market as a system is important for us to take. Just looking at my notes I have taken from you. Yes, I mean, the main point is the not recognizing hegemony as part of moral economy leading its own political economy is an important part that I want to refer, I think, at this point. Thank you. Sorry for taking time.
Thanks a lot, really. And if there is no any points to add, we say goodbye with many thanks. It is, it was a great taste of the book to be read, and we had this chance to know what is in your book, Omer. And I personally am sure that I will read the book.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. We enjoyed. Hopefully you have enjoyed as well. Thank you for colleagues for staying around and listening.
You. Philip, have you anything to say?
Pleased to hear, Philip. Thank you so much, Al.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation.
Yep, let's keep in touch and wishing you all the best.
All the best.
Thank you so much.
And good luck with your PhD, Sahar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Thanks
great
a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So. Okay. Just
Ok, je supprimer les
recording, stop